All right, welcome back. It's Dr. Feist here, Gavin, for the Faculty of Philosophy, with my team of wrestlers here helping me out. And by the way, the Greeks often hung around in gymnasiums and talked about philosophy. One of the great dialogues of Plato, of course, takes place. The Theaetetus, for instance, takes place in a gymnasium where Socrates is hanging out and talking to a bunch of people about a variety of things, namely the issue of knowledge. So one of the reasons for the connection between, shall we say, the gymnasium and philosophy is because the Greeks did ultimately have a view overall that there was a close link between body and mind. You can't have a healthy mind without a healthy body, and to have a healthy body, you're going to somehow have a healthy mind. So the two were linked. Now, we see that a lot. I've been stressing this in terms of, remember, eudaimonia, that's the goal, and eudaimonia is having a harmonious soul at the end of the day. Everything, all the parts of the soul are working at their best in accordance with the virtue that they have, right, and at its best. So everything's functioning and firing on all cylinders. You know, your health is good, your emotions are in order, your reason is functioning fine. Put that all together. That is eudaimonia, ultimately, in the sense of a well-organized, harmonious soul. And there will be different ways of having harmonies. Different kinds of harmonies can exist. So not all people that possess eudaimonia are going to be identical. So again, let's dig more into this notion of the different kinds of virtues. And as I mentioned in the previous video, check that out if you didn't watch it, the tail end, shall we say, of Book 6, really chapters 9 through 12, and a little bit of 13, but 9 through 12 bring up the notion of the auxiliary or the virtues, the intellectual virtues annexed to phronesis, as Thomas Aquinas would say. Now, we've looked at the previous ones, synesis and eubulia. Well, there's synesis, right? So synesis and eubulia, those we looked at in the last video. Check that out. Here now, he wants to look at phronesis, and this thing is this interesting term, gnome. Now, he makes a few remarks on this. So gnome, again, is another part of the puzzle. So we've had eubulia, synesis, all part of this story of trying to unpack in more detail what phronesis is about. Gnome, what's that? Right? Kind of an interesting term to pronounce even, so it's a little bit different. What are we talking about? Well, that has a whole variety of translations. Again, all these terms, if what's can get super confusing, you might say, why is he always using this Greek? But it can get even worse because different translations will use the same translation for different Greek words. And so you can get quite lost if you're comparing translations. So it's always good to know the Greek term, and then when you're reading the text, you can use it to supply the English. So that's why I want to make sure that you have a little bit of handle on these original Greek terms. And it just brings the original Greek text a little closer. All right, gnome, what are we talking about? What's it got to do with phronesis, and what is this thing called gnome? Well, Aristotle he sort of introduces this look. Again, Aristotle's methodology is sometimes very empirical. Well, look at what's going on. Look at what people say. Now, if you say that someone is, as he says, considerate of others, someone who is a kind of forgiving, not ridiculously over-forgiving, but someone who has the ability to be compassionate, to be considerate, someone who is, fair-minded. When we say, well, Sally's a very reasonable person, we're not just saying she does logic all day. We're saying she's got a sense of fair play, right? The boss is coming. Is he got a new boss coming in? Is he got a sense of fair play? Is he going to be sensitive? Is he going to be sympathetic? Is she going to be attentive to our concerns? Is she going to care a little bit about us? So this sort of, shall we say, this amalgam of all these terms of someone who's got a sense of fair play and is considerate about others. It's not just simply being kind, because the person may not be warm and fuzzy. That doesn't necessarily matter. What we're talking about is someone who has a sense of fair play, and when they do things, factors in the needs and desires and the happiness and all that of others. So this ability to do that is more or less what Aristotle is the virtue of gnome. Right? And we can see how that would be very important. This is also kind of looks and feels like when Aristotle was talking about the virtue of justice, right? Talking about others. And you go back and look at the stuff on justice, because gnome is kind of like a legalistic sort of rational fair play counterpart. So again, it's like when we say, she's reasonable or he's reasonable in his or her dealings. We're kind of talking about gnome. Now, Aristotle makes a couple interesting points. He looks at a variety of these things, recalls them like gnome, synesis, phronesis, and nous. These are not things really in a way that we actually completely learn. So Aristotle does tinker a little bit. Remember the moral virtues, the character virtues. Those dealt with the emotions, getting those straight. Those were learned through habituation. Remember, all the virtues really have to be learned. He says, so far, all the virtues have to be learned through habituation, moral virtues, character virtues, instruction, intellectual virtues, techne, and all that stuff. But on the other hand, Aristotle does say, well, I'm going to modify that a little bit. So don't always take Aristotle at face value exactly when he says something, because later on he will modify. He says, things like gnome, synesis, phronesis, and nous, they sort of show up in people that are old enough to display them. And these things, all of these virtues, of course, they deal with particulars. They don't deal with generalities or eternal truths and all that. And these virtues kind of show up have a certain age, right? So he talks about nous at the end of it all, right? This is a critical one, because nous is responsible for really bringing us close into contact with reality, whether it's the realities that are eternal and mathematical and all these things, or the concrete realities, the particulars of everyday experience. So the big universals and the concrete particulars, those are sort of apprehended through this nous. Now, Aristotle makes a number of interesting points, but one thing I want to pick up on is these are, as I said, these are not moral virtues, these guys, so they're not acquired by habit, but it doesn't always follow that intellectual virtues, these guys, are taught. But Aristotle said, well, intellectual virtues are learned by instruction. And it doesn't always seem to be the case for every intellectual virtue. He says that, gnome, synesis, phronesis, and nous seem to be given by, in a sense, by nature. Right? He says you're born with them, and we might think, and you're not at all. Like Aristotle, we might think of as putting this in. We could put Aristotle in a more modern vocabulary when we say something like, well, children, let's say at the age of 6, that's the age of reason. That's a common expression. I'm not too concerned about just how exactly accurate it is, but we often talk about that. Children at a certain age, around 6, it's the age of reason. They start having a capacity for demonstrating and thinking more logically and more reasonably. Children of very young ages, they're not very good at being worried about the likes and wants and needs of others. If you get a group of toddlers, they're not too terribly concerned with each other in the way that we would like to think. We have to train them, and Aristotle says, maybe in some sense it might not be truly this kind of training that does it. It's that something that might be, in a sense, given by nature, and they come out at certain points in life. So, and these virtues don't just show up all at once. They show up at particular ages. And it's like when we say, oh, well, so-and-so doesn't have a certain kind of skill or a virtue right now, but give her a couple of years and that'll come out. And also, we do say, as Aristotle points out, there are some people that we say, well, if you haven't got that sort of sense of fair play by a certain age, or if you haven't got a sense of sort of the practical wisdom of phronesis at a certain age, maybe you'll just never have it. right? Maybe it's just not really going to be there. So Aristotle does, waffle a little bit on this notion of maybe it is nature that implants certain things with us. He certainly tends to lean to that in sections of this chapter, and other senses in the other chapters he pulls away from that. So there's a bit of a tension here. But in any case, it doesn't seem that phronesis is really, at the end of it all, Aristotle's position doesn't seem to be that phronesis really is given by nature. That's really something that is learned. But these intellectual, these minor ones, you might be able to make the case that it has to have something sort of in you. You have to have a sense of fair play. If you're ever going to develop that, you have a sense of gnome sort of hardwired into you if you're ever going to really develop a true sense of phronesis. So they might be kind of conditions under which the more advanced moral virtues, intellectual virtues can develop. So this idea of virtues building on virtues, you can find it in Aristotle. He'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this book, and I'll get to that presently. Now, Aristotle concludes with a couple more comments, and he says, this shows that we should, he thinks that this supports the idea that we should listen to, and this is maybe a bit startling, but this shows, as again, I've been trying to say that Aristotle has a conservative streak in him. Here's another example of it. He says you should listen to your elders, even their unproved assertions. Why? Well, because they've been around a long time. And if these things have a connection to being given by nature, these people are old enough to display this and old enough to sort of see things. Right? They're good at seeing things. They're kind of good at this nous, right? Grasping things, knowing what to do, right? It's kind of like, sort of when you think, it's good to have, sometimes people say of a parental figure, your mom or your dad or whatever, I don't really care, or an uncle or an aunt or a grandfather who just always seems to be able to size up a situation and is good at sort of seeing things. And seeing things, what to do in a certain situation or how to handle something. And may not give you a big argument as to what you do. It's just like, I looked at that and I think, do this. That kind of, I looked at it, do this. When it's coming from someone who is older, Aristotle says it's wise to take that seriously. As a matter of fact, he says in many ways, the unproven assertions that come from the older section of the population should be taken really like as seriously as argued for assertions. So in some sense, this sort of general kind of wisdom that people gather, right, in the sense through the course of their life, should be taken quite seriously. In fact, as seriously as some people who are trying to argue for things. So this is an interesting aspect of Aristotle, because it's not the it's not the case in Aristotle that you just always go for big reasoned arguments. No, it's in some cases, that you should take, reasoned arguments into consideration. But experience also is important. So someone, grandfather or grandma who's given you some reflections unproven, like just how I see things, that could be taken, Aristotle says, quite seriously, even as seriously as someone who's trying to make an argument. So it's not the case that it's just rationality and that just rules the day, nothing else. No, Aristotle seems to allow for the importance of experience. All right, so that gives us a few of these minor. We've got another one to go. But in chapter 12, Aristotle's going to ask a question that's extraordinarily important. He's going to say, at the end of the day, is this stuff really all useful? Is this really important? And we're going to answer, of course he's going to answer yes. I mean, don't be in doubt of that. But it's his discussion as to why he thinks is important is going to be critical for understanding the rest of this book. And it gives the next little bit will give a nice overview of all these different virtues that we've talked about and how it's supposed to fit together, because later on in book 7, Aristotle is going to start it off by saying we're starting on a new course. He's going to take a different direction. But in any case, in the next video, we'll look at why Aristotle thinks all this is important, but there are serious criticisms as to why they may not be all that important. Stay tuned.